So, welcome back from lunch, everyone. So collectively, what we've done is we've taken the article and broke it up into various strategies, as you can see it on the board. Joe, Kimberly, and I will talk about the background, and the other two groups will talk about the strategies and negotiating the ethical failure.
Fantastic. So when talking about the background and history, the first thing they kind of talk about is that this isn't a new phenomenon. It's just one that we are identifying now. And really, the idea is that there were not really two experiences, but I guess there were kind of two experiences that lead to someone being a social entrepreneur or a group being social entrepreneurs, which were a traumatic experience or a transformational experience. And sometimes that can be both. And really, what comes of that is that there is a change in mentality that allows them to see that there's an issue with the world and they want to change it, which comes to this deep care, and it may be rooted in their personal beliefs or beliefs that were shaped by these experiences, and that there's an inadequate or no current solution to the issue. So, we have a lot of systems in place for things, but a lot of times we see these new companies come in that are doing similar work, but they're really saying, like, we can do it better. And a lot of that comes from what they talk about with funding. So things like GoFundMe are huge in this because people are able to say, I have a new idea, all I need is the funding. And they're able to raise the funds in that way.
And so for those who have gone through this traumatic or transformative experience, there's this idea of I want to do something more, right? And so the idea can feel isolating because it's just you with this new idea. It's groundbreaking and it's just living in your head. And so not necessarily everybody sees the good in the work that you want to actually do. And then the article in the beginning talked about just comparing business entrepreneurs to those who are going through this social entrepreneurship to some degree. Business entrepreneurs feel like, oh yeah, I'm creating this radical work, but they're actually really just regular business folks, just with a different lens of the way in which they are seen to operate business. Whereas other folks are like, oh no, we're creating this group to work with a marginalized community or group to do some radical work of things that are not actually happening. And so they may see themselves on the same playing fields, but actually there's two distinct paths that they're actually taking.
And so their work can be isolating or feeling like left alone because nobody is jumping on their platform or on their bandwagon to say, this is the good thing, this is how we should solve the problem. So they feel very like marginalized themselves because no one's listening or thinking that they're just this odd person out of the box.
Yeah, and one of the challenges they identified is in those moments, a lot of times you're questioned about why you're doing this thing, or don't we already have this thing? And that's where a lot of that isolation can sit because this is a new idea, but yours is just different. And so if there is a way that works that isn't causing harm, it can just feel like you're wasting your time and all of that. One of the parts of the beginning of the article that they talk about is the historical context with slavery abolitionists and the newspapers that came out and different groups like that being kind of the first of these sorts of organizations that started off. And so they talked a lot about activism as a starting point for this. And when they interviewed individuals, they found all of these different sorts of traumatic experiences that were tied to the work that these entrepreneurs were doing, similar to the people who started these groups back in the 1800s with the slavery abolitionists.
So that's the background of the article, and so the next group will then go ahead and talk about the strategies.
Thanks, all the way back to the hotel.
I know. All right, 3 strategies. So we only have 3, so we will collectively speak about them. So what we did just to kind of set up, looking at the way we structured, is we listed the 3 strategies: reframing challenges, sense of obligation, and measuring success. But we took a deeper dive, looked at what was fact-based from the article, and then what were some of the assumptions that you would have to make based on what they stated. So, Jill, what's the next?
Yeah, so the first one really was about reframing challenges. And, you know, from the article, I mean, this was just a really small section. But looking at some of the common strategies of these particular type of individuals. And the idea behind reframing challenges is being able to put, you know, a positive light and seeing the positivity out of a challenge that's happening. So we looked at this from, as Kyla said, from a fact and an assumption perspective. And fact is individuals who experience trauma or have that transformational experience, from their perspective, have the ability to kind of reframe the challenge that's happening in the environment to the positive outcomes. I think some assumptions that we talked about is, you know, without trauma, are other individuals able to make as great of an impact? And without that event, might they be poor at this concept of reframing or getting people around their cause? So number 2, how did you?
So 2 was the sense of obligation, that the person is sort of brought into this space feeling like they have no choice, but they have to further this cause. And we used the example of Greta Thunberg when she was sitting outside of her school saying, why should I study for this institution and learn these facts when the world may no longer be here, because nobody's hearing us, nobody's doing anything about it. And so the fact was, there was this sort of feeling of no choice, and the assumption was like, this work is mission-based.
And in terms of measuring success, the article stated that most social entrepreneurship organizations do measure their successes. It specified it broke it into 2 different categories. One is that for-profit social entrepreneurship places do so by looking at their financial situation. And then it sort of just vaguely said that those that are not-profit do it in the same way that businesses do, but it didn't really say what it was. So our assumption is that that means that they're looking at their business model and the outcomes of their business plan, and that those business plans include social change agencies.
And just to summarize, one thing we did talk about as a group was that we said these strategies were very individual-based, because it's about the entrepreneur themselves and not necessarily about the organization, but the idea that they will impact the organization, but it's individual with branching out.
Yep.
You can see her leadership at work right here, can't
See
you?
it? I love it.
I'll stand over in
I'm
the
just a follower.
Gotta know when to step up and when to sit back.
Oh, thank you, Dr.
So we looked at the 3rd aspect of this article, which was negotiating the ethical fault line. I'm going to speak to mission creep, which is the basic definition is that it's the revision of goals for the investor or funding, and it may speak to the measuring success where they're looking for funding. Something important to realize is that mission creep is moving beyond the boundaries of where you originally said you were going to work. So if you decide I'm going to, my original goals are to work just with kids, and then suddenly you creep and say, well, we're going to work with kids and maybe adolescents because I can get more revenue. And that isn't done in a collective. So it's not a strategic adaptation if you mission creep. That's a one-time, it's maybe a static event or it's crisis or something of that nature that really drives the creep. Whereas if we say as an organization we're going to start assessing this, that would be strategic adaptation.
No, no worries.
Sorry.
So I'm going to take the top and bottom. So spinning the truth, right, is that phrase where we present something in a way in order to make the response more favorable to us, right? And so again, where the entrepreneur is dependent on seeking support, financial means, right, looking for investors to buy off on the cause they're trying to affect, right? Spinning the truth may be like extending what they actually satisfy. So if an investor says, hey, do you do this? Oh yeah, we do that, just to make sure that, right, you can satisfy it. Or on the back end, right, taking credit for something that you may not have directly affected, right, but spinning the truth. So that becomes like that ethical question, right? Is that right? Because in the end, does the end justify the means, right? And that's something you as an individual have to wrestle with. And then the final one, sometimes the law is broken, right? Civil disobedience, and we've all seen that, whether it's maybe not for a business, but in a lot of like our inspirational leaders, right? Starting a cause or a movement, right? Whether they rally, right? But you're supposed to have like, you're supposed to apply, but they do it anyway, or other reasons. But I think where it becomes a much more compelling conversation is looking at issues like the Sea Shepherd, the anti-whaling, right? So the Sea Shepherd goes down to the Antarctic, right, to try to defeat the Japanese and the Norwegians from whaling, right? But there are some laws that allow them to do it, as well as there are laws on the seas on how you're supposed to act with other ships, right? So they're breaking the laws of the high sea, endangering other crews and other ships, right? And so it does, again, the defense of the whales, does that justify the means? That's why these two are very similar, but then it comes back to your question about what are your ethics based in? Where are you morally grounded? And that just is an enduring dispute.
Okay, so we looked at values and standards, and sacrifice for the growth of the larger purpose of the organization. And I think to my area that I live in my community that I live in Texas, and I think about the Montessori schools, how they started. It was a social entrepreneur, Margaret Montessori, who started this for the better good for kids, preschool, because she said many of the problems we had in education started at the early age. So let me start this for social change and to make a betterment of it. But there was a time when she met in financial crisis, and while the profit is not the focus, there still needs to be some measure of financial stability for the company. And she was caught between, should I twist the laws somewhat in terms of who I brought in, who should I exclude in order to get more money in? And she stood her ground on that issue. But there are times when values are quote unquote become questionable, being compromised. And I look at it even in special education. I am totally against kids being pushed in that area, but there are times when I'm called into the office and they're like, Loy, I do understand you don't need so many kids coming in because you don't think they qualify, but in terms of funding for the school, this is where most of our funding comes from. I cringe. And so you're caught between, do I keep my job or do I have kids coming in that I know do not qualify? And I'm caught in that dance between morality and ethics.
Wow.
Very hard, yes, very tough place to be in. But then when you hear this, it is a Title I fund that pushes that school. Without that money, our school closes because we are no longer financially viable to stay open. And so to the very door I want to close that says no more of these kids should come in here. They are suited to be in general ed. I just need teachers to modify how they teach and to change the way they teach. But then I hear, if you keep this door closed, then the whole system shuts down. And so that's where the ethical fault line comes in. Do I need the whole thing to cave in? Or do I have to know how to dance from one crack to the other? So that's something.
We took my workshop when I did on conflict and negotiation, and I talked about this very issue of values and conflict and exit voice loyalty. Yeah.